It's June 19th, 2026, and Moscow was on fire yesterday. Still is at this point. Not metaphorically, literally. Look at this footage right here. Black smoke columns, so thick they were visible from satellites. The Gazprom neft oil refinery in the Kapotnya district, 9 miles from the Kremlin, burning for the second time in a single week. This analysis is built entirely from open source footage, verified reporting, and public statements, so we can walk through it together. Reports put the number of Ukrainian drones launched that night somewhere around 550, with some estimates running as high as 900. Roughly 194 of them are believed to have gotten through Moscow's air defenses and reached the capital region. Airports shut down, flights canceled across multiple hubs serving the city. Watch this. The top of this oil storage tank gets thrown hundreds of feet into the sky in a single blast. That's not a normal drone strike result, and we're going to walk through exactly what caused it, because the footage tells a more interesting story than it looks like at first glance. This was the largest drone attack on Moscow since the war began. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov's response was about as vague as it gets. He said Russian forces are working on it and will continue to do so. Translate that however you want, but it's not the language of a country that has a clean answer for what just happened. Ukrainian President Zelensky was far more direct, standing in Brussels in front of NATO defense ministers and saying plainly that if Ukraine burns, Moscow burns too. Here's the part of the timeline worth sitting with for a second. 4 days before this attack, Russia struck the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, a UNESCO-protected Orthodox Christian monastery and one of the most significant religious sites in the Orthodox world. Zelensky visited the damage himself, stood in front of cameras, and said directly that Russia would see Ukraine's answer. What we're looking at in Moscow right now appears to be that answer playing out. So before we get into the breakdown, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I'm curious how far this story is traveling. Let's go through the raw footage first, because there's a detail in here that matters more than the explosion itself. You can see Russian anti-drone interceptor rockets firing up into the night sky, trying to bring these things down before they reach their targets. This is one of the larger oil facilities serving Moscow, and you can see drones working through what's clearly a contested air picture. That object there has a longer fuselage, no swept wing structure visible, consistent with a longer range one-way attack drone rather than a short-range quadcopter. Now here's the moment worth slowing down for. Watch this tank. There's a streak coming down toward it, then the top blows completely off. Slow that down. That trajectory doesn't match an inbound drone strike pattern. It looks like an interceptor rocket missing its target and continuing on into the tank itself. Russia's layered air defense includes shoulder-fired manned portable air defense systems, MANPADS, alongside larger radar-guided interceptors. And in this footage, it appears one of those interceptor rockets is what actually opened that tank, not the drone it was aimed at. If that's accurate, it's a meaningful detail, because it shows the defensive systems contributing to the damage they were meant to prevent. We've seen similar manned portable launch tubes show up in footage out of other conflicts going back years, so the hardware itself isn't new, it's the context that's notable here. Now we're going to break down the drone technology actually getting through Russia's defenses, why this specific refinery was the most strategically valuable target available to Kiev, and later, in the roundup section, why the US-Iran agreement appears to be falling apart days after it was signed. That's coming up about 3/4 of the way through, so stick around for that. Let's rewind to the sequence that set this off. Russia struck a 1,000-year-old monastery, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which Ukrainian officials and many outside observers read as a deliberate escalation against a target with no military value, hitting morale and cultural identity directly. Strikes against cultural and religious sites tend to function as psychological pressure rather than military strategy, and that reading lines up with how both governments have talked about this exchange. So now let's get into the hardware actually behind this attack, starting with Ukraine's primary long-range strike platform, the UJ-26, known as the Bober, which translates to beaver. It was developed through Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate working with domestic industry, and it's become the backbone of these deep strike packages. The airframe uses a canard configuration with a swept fuselage, an inverted tail, and a rear-mounted pusher propeller, which keeps the radar signature low and the range high. Reported range sits around 1,000 kilometers with a payload of roughly 50 kilograms of explosives, including a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating reinforced concrete. The upgrade that's made these genuinely difficult to stop is a real-time FPV-style control link, thermal imaging, and a high-bandwidth data connection that lets a human operator take over manual control during final approach. That means the drone can fly the long cross-country leg on its own and then hand off to a pilot only once it's near the target, which dramatically improves terminal accuracy against something like a storage tank or a refinery unit. Now, here's the part that actually explains why this attack worked when previous ones got mostly intercepted. This wasn't one drone slipping through. This was mass saturation, sending enough drones at once that a layered defense network physically cannot track and intercept all of them in the time available. That's a basic principle of warfare. Overwhelm the defender's processing capacity faster than they can respond. And a percentage gets through no matter how good any individual interceptor is. And the footage we just looked at suggests Russia's interceptor systems themselves became part of the problem, not just the solution. Now let's talk about what this actually costs each side, because the economics here are lopsided in a way that matters for how long this kind of campaign is sustainable. The Panzer Air defense systems Russia is relying on to intercept these drones run around $150,000 per missile. The longer range S-400 interceptors cost between $1 and $3 million each. Ukraine's Bober drones are estimated to cost around $50,000 to produce. So every successful intercept of a $50,000 drone can cost Russia anywhere from 3 to 60 times that amount. And every drone that gets through costs Russia a refinery, not just a missile. That math doesn't favor the side doing the defending, and it's part of why this specific style of attack has become Ukraine's preferred long-range tool. It's worth noting Russia runs a mirror version of this same strategy against Ukrainian cities, launching Shahed drones, originally Iranian-designed and now produced domestically inside Russia, at rates reported to exceed 1,000 per week during intense periods. So this is genuinely a two-way saturation war, both sides trying to So that's the technology and the economics behind this attack. Now let's get into why this specific refinery was the target and what it tells us about where this war is heading. Ukraine didn't hit a military installation this time. They didn't go after command nodes, bombers, or airfields, all of which they've struck successfully before in previous operations. They hit a civilian fuel refinery 9 miles from the Kremlin, one that reportedly supplies a significant share of Moscow's own civilian fuel market. That's a different kind of target, and it points to a different kind of strategy. This isn't about degrading Russian military logistics directly, since Russia has other refineries supplying its forces. It's about something closer to information warfare aimed at the Russian public itself. Worth understanding the broader picture here. Russia's refining capacity has already taken repeated hits over the past 2 years from earlier long-range drone campaigns, and Western sanctions have made it harder to import the specialized parts needed to repair damaged refining units quickly. That combination means damage to facilities. Like this one doesn't just disappear in a few weeks the way it might have earlier in the war, when spare parts and repair crews were easier to source. Each strike against energy infrastructure adds to a cumulative repair backlog, and that backlog has real downstream effects on domestic fuel availability and pricing inside Russia, which is presumably part of the calculation behind targeting it. Zelensky said this part out loud, stating plainly that the goal is for ordinary Russians to start feeling that this war is something one man is waging, while regular people absorb the consequences. Whether that strategy actually shifts Russian public sentiment is a genuinely open question, since Russian state media controls most of the domestic narrative, and there's no clear historical precedent for fuel price pressure alone changing the political calculus around an ongoing war. But the choice of target tells you Kyiv is thinking past the battlefield and toward the home front, which is its own kind of escalation. Now let's shift to something that broke at almost the exact same time and adds another layer to this week. The ink had barely dried on a new U.S.-Iran memorandum of understanding when Vice President Vance's planned trip to Switzerland, where follow-up negotiations were set to begin, was abruptly canceled. Journalists were already gathered. Advance teams were in position. Then the White House issued a statement saying the Vice President was not departing. The apparent trigger was a major Israeli air campaign in southern Lebanon overnight, reportedly killing at least 21 people, following an earlier attack that killed 4 Israeli soldiers. Israeli National Security Minister Ben-Gvir stated directly that the Trump administration's agreement does not bind Israel's actions. Vance had reportedly warned Israel publicly just hours earlier to respect the broader peace process, and the strikes happened anyway. So you've got a fresh diplomatic agreement, a major escalation undercutting it within hours, and a public statement from inside the Israeli government essentially saying the agreement doesn't apply to them. That's a serious problem for the credibility of any broader regional deal. And it's worth watching closely over the coming days, because agreements that get publicly disregarded by a party to the underlying conflict tend not to hold for long. It's worth stepping back on the Iran piece specifically, since this memorandum of understanding had already drawn criticism before this latest escalation even happened. Critics on different sides of the debate have raised concerns ranging from the scale of financial commitments involved to whether the agreement adequately addresses Iran's broader regional activity. Supporters of the deal have argued it represents a rare diplomatic opening after years of stalled talks, and that walking away now would waste whatever leverage exists. Both of those positions have been argued publicly by people who follow this closely. And it's genuinely too early to say which read holds up, especially with the Lebanon strikes complicating things within the first day. Comments on coverage like this tend to ask a fair question. which is whether any of these statements actually mean anything, or whether they're just posturing for domestic audiences on every side. That's a reasonable thing to be skeptical about. Diplomatic statements during active conflict are often aimed as much at internal political audiences as at the other side of the table, and it's worth reading all of these statements from Lavrov, from Zelensky, from Ben-Gvir, with that in mind, rather than taking any of them fully at face value. What we can say with more confidence is what the footage and the verified strike data show us, which is why this breakdown has focused on that rather than on predicting outcomes. So let's bring this back to Moscow and close out where we started. What we're actually watching is two parallel saturation campaigns: Ukraine targeting Russian energy infrastructure and military production, Russia targeting Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, both sides trying to make the cost of continuing the war heavier than the cost of stopping it. Neither side has shown signs of that calculation tipping yet. Russia's air defense gaps, including the apparent friendly fire incident we looked at in the footage, suggest real strain on a system that has to defend an enormous amount of territory and infrastructure simultaneously. Ukraine's drone production scaling up suggests a similar but inverse pressure, a country building an indigenous deep strike capability largely from necessity, because other options for hitting targets this far from the front line were never really available to them. Where this goes next probably depends less on any single strike and more on whether either government's calculus around continuing actually shifts, and right now there's no clear evidence that it has, on either side. That's genuinely the honest answer here, not a dramatic one, but an accurate one. So that's the breakdown for this one. What's your read on where this goes from here? More escalation, a stalemate that grinds on, or something that actually forces both sides back to the table? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want more breakdowns like this as the story develops, subscribing helps the channel keep covering it in this kind of detail. Thanks for watching. This is Legacy of Finance, signing off.